Welcome, dear listeners, to a tale that will burrow beneath your skin and settle in the darkest corners of your mind. Tonight, we're descending into the shadows of an old Victorian house where secrets lie hidden beneath the floorboards. Secrets that whisper, scratch, and claw their way into the living world. This is the story of Emily, a girl haunted not by what she sees, but by what she hears. A boy, trapped in the darkness, and a chilling plea. Take my place. So, dim the lights, lock your doors, and listen closely. But beware, the scratching might not be coming from this story. It could be closer than you think. Emily didn't want to move. She had spent most of her 13 years in a sunny little bungalow near the coast, surrounded by the hum of seagulls and the salty tang of the ocean. But when her father's job relocated them to the small, isolated town of Mill Haven, everything changed. The house they moved into, a sprawling Victorian with creaky floorboards and looming gables, felt wrong from the start. The first few days were spent unpacking, trying to turn the house into something resembling home. Emily's parents were optimistic, laughing about the quirks of their new place, the drafty windows, the narrow staircases, the attic door that always seemed to stick. Emily tried to share their enthusiasm, but the house's oppressive atmosphere weighed on her. It felt like the shadows in the corners were thicker, darker, as if they were watching. Her room was on the second floor, a cozy space with an antique bed and a large window overlooking the overgrown garden. On the first night, as Emily lay beneath her heavy quilt, she heard it, a faint scratching noise beneath the bed. She froze, straining to listen. It was so faint that she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. The next morning, she mentioned it to her mom, who brushed it off with a laugh. Old houses make weird noises, honey. It's probably just the wood settling or a mouse in the walls. But Emily wasn't so sure. That night, she stayed awake longer, her ears tuned to every creak and groan of the house. The scratching returned, soft but deliberate, as if someone, was trying to claw its way out. Her heart raced, but she stayed silent, too scared to even peek beneath the bed. By the third night, the dreams began. In her first dream, the room looked just as it did in reality, moonlight spilling through the curtains, the faint glow of her bedside lamp casting long shadows. But something felt off. The air was heavier, colder. She heard the scratching again, louder this time, coming from directly beneath her bed. Slowly, she leaned over the edge, her hair falling like a curtain as she peered into the darkness below. That was when she saw him. The boy's skin was pale, almost gray, like he had been buried for decades. His eyes were dark, empty hollows, and his lips were stitched closed with black thread. Yet somehow, she could hear his voice inside her head. It was a desperate hiss, soft but insistent. "Let me out. I'm trapped. And so are you." Emily woke with a start, gasping for air. Her room was silent except for the faint rustle of the curtains. She told herself it was just a dream, but the vividness of it lingered. The boy's hollow eyes burned into her memory. The next morning at breakfast, Emily hesitated to tell her parents. Her dad was busy scrolling through emails, her mom humming as she packed lunch for work. She didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, she asked, "Did anyone ever live here before us, like kids?" Her mom shrugged. "I'm sure lots of families have lived here. It's such an old house. Why?" "No reason," Emily mumbled, stirring her cereal. She wanted to forget about the dream, but the boy's voice echoed in her mind. "Let me out." The dreams grew worse. Each night, the boy crept closer. He would rise from the floor, his bony fingers clawing at the edge of her bed. His whispers became louder, more insistent. "Take my place. Take my place." His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and his stitched mouth trembled as if trying to speak. By the end of the week, Emily was barely sleeping. The dreams haunted her even in daylight, and the scratching noise beneath the bed became impossible to ignore. Her parents noticed her pale complexion and dark circles, but dismissed it as stress from the move. "You'll feel better once you've made some friends at school," her dad said, squeezing her shoulder. School, however, offered no reprieve. The kids were polite but distant, and Emily found herself eating lunch alone in the library. She felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, as if the house had followed her, its oppressive presence lingering even here. That night, she made a decision: she would stay awake. She had to know if it was real or just in her head. The clock on her nightstand glowed red in the darkness, 11:58 p.m. Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, the quilt pulled around her shoulders. She clutched a flashlight in one hand, her knuckles white. Every creak of the house made her jump, her heart pounding against her ribs. Midnight came and went. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the old wood. Emily began to relax, her eyelids growing heavy. She set the flashlight down, leaning back against the headboard. Maybe it really was just her imagination. Then she heard it, the scratching. It started faint, like before, but quickly grew louder, more frantic. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound came from directly beneath her bed. Slowly, she reached for the flashlight, her fingers trembling. She shone the beam down toward the floorboards, her heart hammering. The wood was shifting. The floorboards at the foot of her bed buckled and cracked, as if something was pushing against them from below. Emily clutched the flashlight tighter, too terrified to move. Then she saw it. A pale, skeletal hand emerged, its bony fingers grasping at the edge of the broken wood. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the boy's head appeared, his empty eyes locking onto hers. His stitched mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as he dragged himself further out of the floor, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Take my place," he whispered, his voice filling her head. "Take my place." Emily's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard. The boy crawled closer, his icy hand reaching for her ankle. She closed her eyes, praying it was just a dream. When she opened them, he was gone. The floorboards were intact, the room eerily quiet. But the cold lingered, and Emily's legs were trembling so badly she couldn't stand. She stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the window. Emily stumbled downstairs, her throat dry. Her parents greeted her with cheerful good mornings, but she barely heard them. She felt like a ghost of herself, her mind consumed by the boy's whispers. As she sat at the breakfast table, her spoon shaking in her hand, she made a silent vow. She would find out who, or what, the boy was. And she would stop him before it was too late. That night, she prepared herself. If the boy returned, she wouldn't run. She would confront him, demand answers. But deep down, Emily feared she already knew the truth. She wasn't dreaming. The boy was real, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. Emily's resolve to confront the boy waned as the daylight hours crept by. The more she thought about him, the more her fear gnawed at her, making her doubt her ability to stand up to whatever he was. The house felt colder that day, as though it had absorbed the echoes of her terror from the night before. The scratches, the boy, the stitched mouth, they couldn't be real. At least that's what she told herself when she ventured back into her room after breakfast. She'd barely set foot inside when a chill slithered up her spine. Her bed, perfectly made when she'd left it, now sat slightly askew, and the floor beneath the foot of it was splintered, just a little, as if someone had been there. Emily forced herself to kneel and peer under the bed. She saw nothing but shadowy emptiness and a thin coating of dust, though her skin prickled as if unseen eyes were watching her. She backed away, slamming the door shut behind her, and didn't return to her room for the rest of the day. At school, Emily's exhaustion and paranoia made her irritable and distant. The whispers of the boy still lingered in her mind, overlapping with the ambient noise of the cafeteria and the chatter in hallways. Teachers noticed her zoning out during lessons, her gaze unfocused as if lost in some unseen nightmare. When one teacher asked if she was okay, Emily merely nodded, not trusting herself to explain. During lunch, she retreated to the library, where she sat at a desk flipping through old books about local history. She searched for anything that could explain the boy, why he was haunting her room, and what he meant by, "Take my place." The whispers of the boy still lingered in her mind, overlapping with the ambient noise of the cafeteria and the chatter in hallways. Teachers noticed her zoning out during lessons, her gaze unfocused as if lost in some unseen nightmare. When one teacher asked if she was okay, Emily merely nodded, not trusting herself to explain. During lunch, she retreated to the library. The quietness was a relief, and she tucked herself into a corner with a stack of old books. Emily skimmed through dusty pages, looking for anything that could explain her experiences. She wasn't sure what she was searching for until her fingers paused on a book titled The Hauntings of Mill Haven. The cracked leather binding and faded gold lettering gave it an air of ominous importance. Flipping through the brittle pages, Emily's heart began to race. Stories of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths filled the book. One chapter described the house she now lived in. It mentioned a boy named Nathaniel, his name repeated in hushed tones throughout town as the boy who never left. Emily had to catch her breath as she read the details. Nathaniel had been the youngest son of the family who built the house in the late 1800s. He was described as shy, often overlooked, and prone to wandering off alone. One winter night, he vanished without a trace. His family searched desperately, but all they found were faint scratches beneath the floorboards of his room. Next to the text was a grainy black and white photo of a boy. Though the quality was poor, Emily recognized his hollow, haunting eyes. She slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. If Nathaniel was the boy in her dreams, what did he want? And why was he haunting her? Emily stared at the closed book, her heart pounding in her chest. The librarian glanced over, startled by the loud thud of the book hitting the desk, but Emily didn't care. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to open it again, her trembling fingers brushing against the rough, yellowed pages. She needed answers. The next section of the chapter detailed rumors surrounding Nathaniel's disappearance. Locals whispered that his father, a strict and cruel man, had punished Nathaniel by locking him in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. The story claimed that the boy had been forgotten for days during a blizzard. By the time the family remembered to check, it was too late. Emily's stomach turned as she read the grisly details. Nathaniel's body was never recovered, but neighbors claimed they could hear scratching and faint cries coming from the house for weeks afterward. The family moved away shortly after, leaving the house abandoned for decades. Over the years, the house developed a reputation for being cursed. Tenants rarely stayed long, and strange occurrences, voices, cold spots, and missing objects were often reported. What chilled Emily most was the last paragraph of the chapter. Though the family claimed Nathaniel was merely missing, the scratches beneath the floorboards told another story. Witnesses said the markings appeared to spell a single word, over and over: help. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. Her mind flashed to the faint scratching she had heard at night. Was Nathaniel still trapped beneath the floorboards even now? She continued reading, hoping for some solution, but the book offered none. It ended with an ominous warning. The boy beneath the floorboards is said to call out to those who occupy his room. Many who hear him speak of strange dreams and whispers, urging them to take his place. Once his voice is heard, escape is nearly impossible. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and Emily closed the book again. She thought of the boy's stitched mouth, the way he whispered in her mind, "Take my place." Her stomach churned as the implication sank in. Nathaniel wasn't just trapped. He wanted someone else to take his place. That was why he was haunting her. Emily stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She needed to leave the library, needed fresh air. As she walked through the quiet stacks, her thoughts raced. Was it possible to stop this? Could she free Nathaniel without losing herself? That night, Emily locked her bedroom door and stuffed a towel under the crack at the bottom. She knew it wouldn't keep Nathaniel out, but it made her feel a sliver of control in a situation spiraling into terror. She sat on her bed with the flashlight clenched in her hands, the faint hum of the old house her only company. For hours, nothing happened. Midnight came and went. The silence in the room thickened, so absolute that Emily could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she forced herself to stay awake, her eyes darting to the floorboards every few minutes. And then it started. A faint creak, followed by a dragging sound, like nails scraping against the wood. Emily's breath hitched as she tightened her grip on the flashlight. She aimed it at the floor, her hands trembling so badly the beam shook. The noise grew louder, more deliberate, as if Nathaniel wanted her to know he was there. The floor beneath her bed groaned. Emily leaned forward, holding her breath as she tried to peer into the shadows. But this time, it wasn't just the floorboards shifting. Her dresser moved. It was slight at first, a shudder, a scrape of wood against wood. Emily froze, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The heavy antique piece jerked again, sliding an inch closer to her bed. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that her breath became visible in faint, ghostly puffs. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just stop." The dresser responded with another violent lurch, tipping slightly to the side. The bottom drawer slid open, revealing a black void where there should have been neatly folded clothes. Emily felt her stomach twist as a low, guttural whisper spilled out from the darkness inside. "Emily." Her name, distorted and drawn out, echoed in the room. Emily stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam rolled across the room, illuminating the far corner where the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe. Her back hit the wall as the whisper came again, louder this time. "Take my place." The whisper shifted into a chilling, high-pitched giggle, like a child's laugh played on a broken record. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if unseen hands were pressing down on her chest. Emily sank to the floor, her legs trembling too much to hold her up. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The dresser groaned one last time, slamming back into place as if an unseen force had grown bored. The room fell silent once more, but the cold lingered, wrapping around her like a shroud. Emily crawled toward the flashlight, her fingers fumbling for the switch. When the light finally steadied, she turned it toward the floorboards beneath her bed. They were splintered again. And scratched into the wood, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word. "Help." Emily stared at the jagged letters carved into the floorboards, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The word "help" seemed to vibrate with its own energy, a desperate plea from the boy who had clawed his way into her life. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. She scrambled to her feet and backed into the corner of her room, clutching the flashlight as if it were a weapon. Her eyes darted to the dresser, now eerily still, then back to the splintered floorboards beneath her bed. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But where would she go? Her parents wouldn't believe her, not without proof. She couldn't go to them with vague talk of whispers and moving furniture. They'd think she was losing her mind. Tears stung her eyes as she pressed herself harder into the corner, trying to force her thoughts into something coherent. She needed to think. She needed a plan. But the room felt alive, the air thick and heavy with Nathaniel's presence, as though he was watching her from every shadow. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why did you pick me?" Her question was met with silence, but it didn't feel like an absence of sound. It felt intentional, as if Nathaniel was listening, waiting for her next move. Emily's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking together. The dreams, the whispers, the stories and the hauntings of Mill Haven. Nathaniel wasn't just a ghost, he was trapped. His plea for help, the carving in the floor, it was all part of the same terrible truth. He needed her to take his place so he could finally escape, and she couldn't let that happen. With shaking hands, Emily reached for her phone on the nightstand. Her fingers fumbled to unlock it, the cold making her movements clumsy. She opened the flashlight app and aimed its brighter beam at the floorboards. The carved letters glared back at her, stark and sharp against the worn wood. She knelt down, hesitating for a moment before brushing her fingertips over the jagged edges of the letters. The wood was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if whatever force had etched the words still lingered there. She pulled her hand back quickly, wiping it on her pajama pants as a shiver ran through her. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice steadier than she felt. "You want me to help? Fine. But I'm not taking your place." The room remained silent, but a faint shift in the air made her skin prickle. She felt like she was being watched, but there was no sound, no movement. Just the unbearable weight of the boy's presence pressing down on her. Emily swallowed hard and forced herself to her feet. She grabbed the hammer from the toolkit her dad had left in the hall closet, gripping it tightly in one hand. If Nathaniel wanted to keep her trapped in this nightmare, she wasn't going down without a fight. She would find a way to break whatever hold he had on her. With the hammer in one hand and the flashlight in the other, she dropped to her knees by the bed and began prying up the splintered floorboards. Each crack of wood splitting sent her heart racing, but she didn't stop. Beneath the boards, she saw only darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to stretch forever. Emily hesitated, the hammer trembling in her grip. The void felt alive, pulsing faintly as if it were breathing. A faint whisper drifted up from the darkness, barely audible. "Emily." "Enough," she shouted, slamming the hammer onto the floor next to the hole. "If you want help, you need to tell me what happened to you. What do you want from me?" The whisper ceased. The void seemed to shrink back, the oppressive feeling in the air lifting slightly. Then, in the quiet that followed, Emily felt something cold brush against her hand. She jerked back, her heart hammering in her chest. From the void, a skeletal hand reached upward, its bony fingers curling over the edge of the floorboards. She scrambled away, pressing herself against the wall as the hand clawed at the opening, pulling itself further into view. The boy's face appeared, pale and hollow-eyed, his stitched mouth trembling as if he were trying to speak. "Let me out," he whispered, his voice filling the room even though his lips never moved. "Take my place." Emily's vision blurred with tears, but she shook her head violently. "No, I won't. Tell me how to help you without that." Nathaniel's empty eyes fixed on hers. For a moment she thought he might retreat, but then his skeletal hand slammed onto the floor with surprising force. The vibrations rattled her teeth, and the cold in the room became unbearable. "You can't save me," he hissed, "but you can stay. Forever." The boy's hand stretched toward her, his fingers impossibly long now, sharp like claws. Emily scrambled to her feet, the hammer still clenched in her hand. She swung it in a wide arc, and the force shattered the edge of the floorboards, sending wood splinters into the void. Nathaniel's hand recoiled with an inhuman screech, disappearing into the darkness. The hole in the floor seemed to seal itself, the void vanishing as if it had never been there. The room fell silent once more, and Emily stood trembling, the hammer slipping from her grasp. She sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. Her whole body shook as the realization hit her. She wasn't just fighting a ghost. Nathaniel was something far worse. And if she couldn't figure out how to stop him, he would never stop coming for her. The next morning, Emily's resolve hardened. She couldn't keep reacting to whatever Nathaniel threw at her. She needed to be proactive, to uncover the truth and figure out how to stop him. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but the fear of doing nothing outweighed the fatigue. After a rushed breakfast and a half-hearted excuse to her parents about needing to stay late at school for a project, Emily headed straight back to the library. She didn't even notice the librarian's curious glance as she marched toward the section where she had found The Hauntings of Mill Haven. This time, she didn't just skim the book, she pored over every word, taking notes in her battered notebook. The text confirmed much of what she already knew about Nathaniel's disappearance. His father's cruelty, the scratching sounds, and the rumors of the curse all matched. But buried near the end of the chapter was a detail she hadn't noticed before. Some claimed that Nathaniel's spirit became bound to the house, but others believe he was drawn into something far darker, a void between worlds, created by the despair and malice within those walls. Emily's breath hitched. A void, It sounded exactly like what she had seen beneath the floorboards. Her hand tightened around the notebook as she read on. According to local lore, the void was not just a prison but a trap that ensnared anyone who came into contact with it. The more a person interacted with the entity within the void, the stronger its hold became. She shivered, her mind flashing back to the night before, the way the cold had seeped into her bones, the feeling of being watched. If the void was growing stronger, then Nathaniel's power must be too. The text offered no clear solution, but it did mention a recurring figure in the stories, a woman named Abigail Gossamer. Abigail had been a medium who lived in Mill Haven during the late 19th century, known for her work with restless spirits. The book claimed that Abigail had been called to the house shortly after Nathaniel's disappearance. She attempted to cleanse the home but left abruptly, refusing to return. Her last recorded words on the matter were ominous. What lies beneath cannot be freed. It can only be contained. Contained? Emily frowned, tapping her pen against her notebook. If Abigail had found a way to contain the void, maybe Emily could figure it out too. But how? She took a deep breath, flipping back to the book's index. Abigail's name appeared several times with references to other hauntings she had investigated. One of the entries led her to another book, Echoes of the Beyond. Emily found it buried on a dusty shelf and flipped through its pages, scanning for anything useful. Her eyes landed on a passage describing Abigail's methods. The medium had used a combination of protective symbols, salt barriers, and objects imbued with personal significance to ward off spirits. But one line stood out above all. To weaken an entity's connection to this world, one must sever its ties to the place where it anchors itself. Emily closed the book, her pulse quickening. Nathaniel was tied to the house, specifically to her room. If she could figure out what was anchoring him, something physical or symbolic, maybe she could weaken his hold. But what could it be? Her thoughts spiraled as she stared at the notes she had scribbled in her notebook. Could it be the floorboards themselves, the house, or was it something Nathaniel's father had left behind? That night, armed with her growing determination, Emily decided to search the house for clues. Her parents were watching a movie downstairs, the muffled sound of explosions and laughter drifting up through the floorboards. She felt a twinge of guilt about sneaking around, but the urgency of her situation outweighed everything else. She started with her room, meticulously inspecting every corner. She pried at the edges of the floorboards with the hammer, revealing decades-old dust and debris, but nothing out of the ordinary. Her flashlight beam skimmed across the walls and ceiling, searching for markings or hidden symbols, but the room seemed frustratingly normal. Next, she turned her attention to the attic. The air grew colder as she climbed the narrow staircase, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The attic was a maze of forgotten belongings, dusty trunks, warped furniture, and crates that smelled faintly of mildew. Emily's heart raced as she moved carefully through the clutter, her ears straining for any sign of movement. Near the far corner, she spotted an old chest, its surface scarred and discolored with age. Something about it felt wrong, as if the air around it was heavier. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the latch before forcing herself to open it. Inside was a collection of odd, mismatched items, a child's shoe, a rusted pocket watch, and a thin bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Emily carefully unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the spidery handwriting. The words were sharp and scathing, a father's angry reprimands to his useless son. Her stomach twisted as she read the final line of the letter. "You'll learn discipline, Nathaniel, even if it's the last thing I teach you." Emily clenched the paper tightly, her knuckles white. This chest had to belong to Nathaniel's father. It was filled with relics of his cruelty, memories of the suffering that had tied Nathaniel to the house. Her fingers hovered over the pocket watch. Was this his anchor? If she destroyed it, would it weaken his hold? The air in the attic seemed to shift, a faint whisper brushing against her ear. "Emily!" She whipped around, her flashlight scanning the darkness, but she saw nothing. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the pocket watch and the letters, shoving them into her bag. She wasn't sure what to do with them yet, But she knew one thing: she had found something important. Emily returned to her room, her bag slung over one shoulder and her heart pounding like a drum. She carefully set the pocket watch and letters on her desk, the faint light from her bedside lamp casting long shadows over the objects. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the items themselves carried some unseen weight. She shivered, her breath visible in the cold that seemed to radiate from them. She glanced at the floorboards near her bed. Though they looked intact, she could still feel Nathaniel's presence, like a pressure at the back of her mind. If she was right, if these items were tied to him, destroying them might give her a chance to break his hold. But what if she was wrong? What if it made him angrier? You can't live like this forever, she told herself. It's time to act. She started with the pocket watch. Its surface was tarnished, the once shiny metal now dull and pitted. Emily turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the initials engraved on the back. JLH. Her stomach churned as she imagined the man who had used this watch, the father who had terrorized Nathaniel and possibly condemned him to the void. Grabbing the hammer from under her bed, Emily placed the watch on the floor. Her hands shook as she raised the hammer high. She hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. What if destroying it made things worse? What if it was a mistake? A faint whisper floated through the room, freezing her in place. Emily. Her breath caught. The whisper was softer than before, almost pleading. It sent a chill down her spine, but it also steeled her resolve. I'm sorry, Nathaniel, she whispered, but I can't let you take me. She brought the hammer down with all her strength. The impact rang out like a gunshot, and the pocket watch shattered into pieces, its delicate gears scattering across the floor. For a moment, the room was still. Then the temperature plummeted, and a deafening scream tore through the air. It wasn't a human scream. It was something deeper, raw and unnatural, filled with anguish and rage. Emily stumbled back, dropping the hammer. Her ears rang as the scream echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls. The shadows around her seemed to thicken, coiling and writhing like living things. She scrambled for the flashlight, aiming its beam wildly, but it did little to dispel the oppressive darkness. The floor beneath her bed creaked loudly, and the boards began to buckle. Emily's stomach lurched as she saw the void forming again, black and endless. Nathaniel's skeletal hand emerged first, clawing at the floorboards with frantic desperation. His hollow eyes appeared next, locking onto hers with a terrible intensity. You shouldn't have done that, his voice hissed, louder than before, filling the room. Emily backed away, her heart pounding. You said you wanted help, she shouted, her voice trembling. I'm trying to free you. Free me? Nathaniel's voice was a twisted mix of rage and despair. You've only made it worse. The floorboards cracked further, and more of Nathaniel's gaunt figure emerged. His stitched mouth trembled as he pulled himself closer, his bony fingers clawing toward her. Emily grabbed the letters from her desk and held them out like a shield. Is this it? She cried. Is this what's keeping you here, these letters? Nathaniel froze, his hand hovering midair. The void behind him seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the oppressive feeling in the room grew even heavier. His eyes darkened, and his voice became softer, almost sad. They were his words, he whispered. His curse. Emily's mind raced. The letters had to be tied to his suffering, to the anchor that kept him trapped. If I destroy these, will it free you? Nathaniel didn't answer, but his gaze shifted to the letters in her hands. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed her bedside lamp and yanked the shade off. She unscrewed the bulb and poured the oil from the base over the letters, her hands trembling. Nathaniel lunged toward her, his skeletal form moving with terrifying speed. No, he screamed, his voice echoing with desperation. Emily struck a match, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The flame caught the oil-soaked letters, and they burst into flames. The fire crackled and hissed, the edges of the paper curling into blackened ash. Nathaniel screamed again, the sound piercing and inhuman, as his body began to dissolve into the void. The room shuddered violently, books and picture frames toppling from shelves. Emily shielded her face as the light from the burning letters flared bright, filling the room with a blinding glow. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. When Emily opened her eyes, the room was silent. The void beneath the floorboards was gone, the cracks in the wood sealed. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Emily collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. The shattered pieces of the pocket watch lay scattered around her, and a pile of ashes smoldered where the letters had been. She stared at them, her mind reeling. Had she done it? Was Nathaniel finally gone? The faint sound of scratching echoed from beneath the bed, sending a chill down her spine. It wasn't over. The scratching grew louder, sharper, as if mocking Emily's momentary relief. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling, and aimed the flashlight at the floor. The boards remained intact, no sign of the void she had just sealed. But the sound was unmistakable, echoing from below like fingernails on stone. Emily gritted her teeth. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The room answered with silence, heavy and suffocating. Then, as if in response, the letters she had burned began to shift. The ashes on the floor swirled together, forming jagged words that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Help me!" Emily backed away, her pulse racing. "I tried to help you," she yelled. "I destroyed the watch, the letters, I did everything I could." The ashes swirled again, faster this time, as the temperature in the room plummeted. New words formed. Not enough. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room began to move, stretching and writhing like living things. Emily felt the air grow heavier, her chest tightening as a deep, guttural whisper filled the room. "You can't escape," the voice said. It wasn't just Nathaniel. It was something deeper, more malevolent, as if the void itself had begun to speak. "You must take his place." "No," Emily shouted, grabbing the hammer again. Her hands were slick with sweat, but she gripped it tightly, refusing to give in. "I won't let you take me." The floorboards at the center of the room buckled violently, splinters flying as the void tore itself open once more. This time, it was larger, a gaping chasm of darkness that pulsed and shimmered with a sickly green glow. Nathaniel's form emerged from the abyss, but he wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures reached upward, their skeletal hands clawing at the edges of the hole. Nathaniel's face was contorted with pain and anger. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not me. It's the void. It won't let me go." Emily's grip on the hammer faltered. For the first time, she saw something human in Nathaniel's hollow eyes, a flicker of fear, of regret. But the shadows around him surged forward, their whispers growing louder, drowning out his voice. "Take my place," they chanted in unison. "Take my place, take my place." Emily's back hit the wall as the void expanded, its darkness spilling out into the room like smoke. The shadows slithered toward her, their icy tendrils wrapping around her ankles and wrists. She swung the hammer wildly, the metal passing through them without resistance. Her mind raced. This isn't just about Nathaniel. The void wants someone, anyone, to take his place. Her eyes darted to her desk, where the broken remnants of the pocket watch lay scattered. The thought hit her like a bolt of lightning. It's not about destroying what ties him here. It's about breaking the cycle. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily forced herself to step toward the void. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if confused by her movement. Nathaniel's head tilted, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You can't." Emily clenched her fists, her heart pounding. "You don't have to stay," she said, "but I'm not taking your place. We're ending this." She stepped closer to the edge of the void, the shadows clawing at her skin, their whispers turning into agonized screams. Her mind flashed back to the book's mention of Abigail Gossamer. What lies beneath cannot be freed, it can only be contained. Emily realized the truth. She couldn't free Nathaniel, but maybe she could contain the void. Reaching deep into her bag, she pulled out the last thing she had grabbed from the attic, a small, dusty mirror that had been buried at the bottom of the chest. It wasn't much, but mirrors were said to trap spirits. It was all she had. She raised the mirror toward the void, its cracked surface catching the faint green glow. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "This ends now." The void shuddered violently, the shadows recoiling as if burned. Nathaniel's form began to dissolve, his skeletal hand reaching toward her. "No," he cried, "don't leave me here." "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't save you." She hurled the mirror into the void. The glass shattered on impact, sending shards of light cascading through the darkness. The void convulsed, its edges curling inward as if collapsing in on itself. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating one by one. Nathaniel's face twisted in agony as the void pulled him back, his voice echoing into the darkness. "Thank you." With a deafening roar, the void sealed itself shut, the floorboards snapping back into place as if nothing had happened. The room fell silent, the air warm and still. Emily collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as the adrenaline drained from her body. It was over, or so she thought. Emily's breath finally began to slow as the void sealed shut, the room eerily still. For the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself to believe it was over. She set the hammer down on the floor, her hands trembling, and leaned against the wall for support. The oppressive cold had vanished, replaced by a comforting warmth. But then, she noticed something strange. Her bed, its rumpled sheets that she had left earlier, were now smooth and pristine, as if someone had carefully tucked them in. Her stomach churned as a chill slid down her spine. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the bed. That was when she saw him. Nathaniel lay there, his pale, fragile form curled up beneath the blanket, as though he had been there all along. His hollow eyes were closed, his face relaxed, almost peaceful. For a moment, he looked like any other sleeping boy, until Emily's gaze shifted to his stitched mouth. Her heart stopped. The whisper came again, soft and taunting, wrapping itself around her. "It's not over, Emily." Nathaniel's eyes shot open. And so, dear listeners, we leave poor Emily and her haunted floorboards behind, for now. But beware, for the shadows in her story have a way of creeping into your own. Perhaps tonight, when the house is quiet and the hour grows late, you'll hear a faint scratching under your bed, and wonder if the boy has found a new place to stay. But before you let your imagination carry you away, I invite you to return next time for another tale of dread and mystery. Our next story, The Face in the Ice, will take you to the icy desolation of the Arctic, where an explorer discovers something frozen in the ice, a face that looks eerily familiar. As the ice begins to melt, so too does the boundary between man and monstrosity. What emerges from the frost will chill you far deeper than the cold itself. So until then, my friends, keep your lights low, your doors locked, and your courage close. After all, you never know what might be waiting for you in the dark.